You know how they say that communication in romantic relationships is the single most important indicator of the health of the relationship? Well, this is even more true in intentional communities, because not only is it one-on-one relationship, it's 1-on-16, it's 1-on-50. There are so many more complexities when you're living in intentional community, and so communication failures and breakdowns are even more apparent and evident. It's very easy to navigate those communication breakdowns when it's just one-on-one and there aren't external pressures. However, what I've noticed, having lived for several years in different intentional communities, eco-villages, and urban regenerative living hubs all over the world, is that communication as a group has so many extra dynamics layered onto it than just interpersonal relationships. So today I'm sharing a framework that I developed that helps process what stage of communication you should engage with to initiate conflict resolution. So this framework I developed simply by making observations of the different intentional communities that I lived in, and it's an appropriate way to kind of graduate through the different levels of communication. And it really starts with self. So the different levels are self to self, self to peer, mediated peer to peer, group to peer, and then a leadership intervention. And I'm going to go through each of those and explain their significance and how to apply them. So number one is self to self. So the founder of Los Portales Eco Village in, I forget if it's Spain or Portugal, basically shares that if you're not in intentional community to become a better person, then intentional community is not for you. So the growth that has to happen when it comes to sharing life with other people is tremendous. It's really a high expectation for you to be very in tune with yourself, your own needs, what's true for you, in order to effectively share that with others and remain in alignment. And we really grow out of alignment when we aren't practicing introspection. The level of self to self is like, when someone does something that you just, you can't stand, it bothers you, or it's like a low level irritation, so you don't want to say anything, or it's like a huge, like, I can't believe that person would ever think that this type of behavior is acceptable. The first step is always to look inward. So this might seem obvious, but this framework is to help guide you in terms of knowing which level to engage at. And each level really should go in order, because essentially each level escalates conflict. So the way to de-escalate conflict is to first start with the self-to-self level. So practicing that introspection, asking yourself questions like, okay, what wound is this coming from? What projections am I putting onto the other person? What assumptions am I making? Does this come from like a previous trauma? Where am I being unempathetic towards their needs? And all of that. And it's like also too, like, what is the actual need that is not being met in this situation? All of these answers come from asking yourself, and can really only come from that self-inquiry. So that level of consciousness is needed to then engage with someone like intentionally. Otherwise you'll you'll just engage through reaction and knee-jerk response that's not really responding. We say there's a difference between reacting and responding, and without this level of self to self, which is how you resolve conflict, is actually getting in tune with yourself first. It's never just about the other person in conflict. It's never just about what they did wrong, how they're a terrible person, how you guys just aren't, that person isn't compatible with your way of living, which is the superior way of living. All of those things genuinely need to be examined at the level of yourself. So that's step number one. And really, conflict can't advance maturely without processing that step. So some actions associated with that step would include journaling, like just talking it out with yourself, making notes and like looking at your history and figuring out like, well, is there a trigger at play? Is there something that like I'm not seeing about this person? Because knowing yourself is the only way you can connect with another person to create resolution. So really it's more so whatever practices you have that get in tune with yourself, whether it's dancing, meditation, that allow for reflection to come through. Anything that allows you to have insights and commune with yourself, basically, is what we're looking for. That will reveal answers for what's really being activated for you in the situation of conflict. And next is peer-to-peer. And this stage is labeled as such because it assumes that this person, you need to approach them as equals. You need to approach them as not your antagonist, not your aggressor, unless of course like truly in situations of like sexual harassment or verbal harassment or like truly violent behaviors. You want to approach them peer-to-peer. And at this stage, you might be tempted you might be tempted to engage with other people and, you know, gossip and vent about this person, but never truly engage in the peer-to-peer level of like, okay, I need to talk directly to this person. While speaking with trusted friends or family or advisors is part of this peer-to-peer level where you're like processing it socially, the step that people often avoid because it's so uncomfortable and because we aren't trained on how to initiate this is just having that hard conversation. And these sticky conversations, I've developed a lot of trainings for actually how to navigate them. I've studied different frameworks that I'll share in other videos about the best ways to actually initiate, like bringing up potentially sticky stuff or guaranteed sticky stuff. But I'm gonna cover that later, because the idea is that once you've examined your inward self and it can't be resolved. You can't just be like, oh no, that was just me being like uppity about this thing, or oh, this has nothing to do with this person, this is my own wound. They actually aren't even doing anything wrong, it's just me. Or oh, that wasn't a transgression, I just need to mention it lightly, but it's not their fault. Once you've done that inquiry, what can't be skipped is just having a mentioning it to the person. And I know it always feels like the hardest part. It feels like the part that requires the most courage, and people often skip because they're like, I'm not sure how this person's gonna react. Really, most conflict should be able to end at this stage. At stage 2, most conflicts should be able to resolve as long as you're equipped with the skills necessary to communicate your needs authentically. And unfortunately, a lot of conflict sort of festers here because no one truly engages in that step of resolution to mention something maturely, calmly, early. Because what they say is that conflict is resolved the sooner you actually address it. And yes, that doesn't account for sometimes you need to sit and cool down and cool off and reflect. But typically the earlier I mention something, the less time it has to fester and grow into resentment the next time it happens, or people are actually given the chance to change that behavior or that pattern before it happens again and before it escalates. So ideally, of course, most conflict is resolved at this stage. And even though it's often easy to ignore this and want to escalate maybe when it feels really dire to higher levels of I'm gonna skip the peer-to-peer and I'm going to complain about it to the group, or I'm going to skip straight to the last stage, which is intervention from community leadership, which is actually what you want to avoid. One, because it replicates patterns of outsourcing your autonomy and ability to stand up for and advocate yourself to a parental figure, to someone with more power. And obviously there are dynamics and situations of conflict where it is appropriate to escalate to leaders. If there's like interpersonal conflict between someone of leadership or leadership style and decisions, that exists a little bit more in governance. But if there's something like a personal conflict that someone is having with a leader, then there needs to be a pathway and an ultimate sidetrack that isn't like the end game isn't leadership intervention, because then obviously like the leader might intervene and choose an outcome or a final say that's favorable to their version of things and their story. And often we try to affirm our narrative of things as the true one, as is true in like most situations of conflict, is that what we know is what we cling to, rather than kind of explore the mental flexibility it takes to make space for other people's narratives. So given that, I do want to say that while it's not yet developed, I have identified the need for like a parallel track where the ultimate thing is not leadership intervention, if it's truly to that point of like escalation, but that involves the leadership, involving outside counsel or outside intervention, whether that's legal, law enforcement, or simply involving a highly trained mediator that has nothing to do with the community. That would be the final stage where there has to be some sort of like intervention, because if at every stage, self-to-self, peer-to-peer, mediated peer-to-peer, and group intervention, resolution can't be reached for what's best for each of the individuals and the community as a whole, then yes, like a more complex intervention is typically needed. But that's only if you have strongly progressed through each of those stages in order. If you skip one of those stages, then it's like, okay, that doesn't mean you can quickly escalate and cause something emotionally expensive for everyone because of, you know, a pint of ice cream that was eaten, or like the fact that we voted no on someone to move in that you really wanted to move in, or like a disagreement you have about how we run the budget. Like all of those things, it's like usually like should be able to be worked out on the lower levels. If not, there's possibly an unwillingness to communicate or a lack of skills to communicate. So I'm going to be creating other videos that go over those skills and those frameworks that actually help you to know how to engage and initiate conflict. But I wanted to share this framework because it's a really keystone practice I have personally, and I've shared in the communities that I manage, including the one I currently live in outside of San Diego called Wild Seeds Ranch. So this framework allows us to progress through conflict more gracefully because it sets certain expectations about how you need to show up as a community member and as an individual. And this framework is part of a larger training that I've hosted in my community and that I also offer to co-living managers, community founders, and facilitators in community to train their community members on how to properly, consciously use tactics for conscious communication. So this is called, at the risk of being redundant, conscious communication tactics. So conscious communication in community tactics. These are a series of tactics that I've developed, and strategies, games, scripts, frameworks, containers, channels, and like ways to mediate conflict. And it's essentially a PDF presentation that is 7-session workshop that co-living managers and co-living operators and intentional community leaders can offer to their community to train them up and strengthen their ability to communicate with each other. So I'll have those links below, but one last thing I wanted to talk about was how you can actually implement this framework in your community. So I like to have a graphic of it to show people, and this is also included in the conscious communication tactics training. And if you just debrief people on the expectations of how to go through each stage, people are more likely to adopt it and slow down and engage more in each stage. So each stage also comes with like different tools and different ways to practice what's the concept of each stage. And what I found is that in training my community members, this does help people like slow down and examine if they're properly engaging in each stage. So again, beyond showing visually what it looks like, training people on how to do it is included in the conscious communication tactics, but developing your own set of rules around each of these stages is highly recommended. You can customize this to your community and come up with unique ways that you can invite people to self-reflect, can invite people to have peer-to-peer. It's like rather than just texting people directly, it's like you can open up channels for leaving post-it notes or sending little gifts that are meant to be peace offerings, etc. Like you can customize each of the stages of the framework, which I think is really interesting. Beyond that, when it's mediated peer-to-peer, there's so many mediation frameworks that are available when it comes to creating a facilitated experience of deep listening, reflective listening, and repair. When it comes to group intervention, there are less formal ways of creating those systemic change, and typically is deeply tied to like your governance and how you make decisions and how you improve as a community. But some of those basically innovation tactics I'm going to cover in a different video. Finally, when it comes to leadership intervention, I think that's something that requires a lot of tact and rests pretty squarely on the persona of the leader in question and how well you have documented your vision and mission in order to compare if you're actually honoring it correctly. So these are some of the considerations of each stages, which I'll dive into later, but thought it would be interesting to share this framework as it applies to navigating conscious community communication.